I call Shane Retty.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak to this free trade agreement and to this bill, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the Minister, MFAT and MFAT officials for the work they've done over at least the past 5 years to bring us to where we are today. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues around the House, those who worked on the Select Committee and the guidance of the Select Committee Chair Mark Mitchell. Mr Speaker, South Korea, we currently import from South Korea refined oil, cars, electronic equipment and machinery. And we export industrial goods, metals, organic chemicals, forestry products, dairy, beef and lamb, kiwi fruit and buttercup squash. It strikes me that there's 4 major macroscopic benefits to this agreement with Korea. First of all, we get increased access for New Zealand trade and investment to a target market of 50 million people. Secondly, we get some frameworks that we can pin policy on that we can work with. Frameworks for resolving trade and investment issues, frameworks for resolving trade and labour and trade and environmental issues. We also get support for New Zealand's wider trade policy interests in strengthening our economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region. And as we've heard, Mr Speaker, over time 98% of current export tariffs will reduce. I'd like to look at some of them in a little bit more detail. What we'll see, Mr Speaker, is that the beneficiaries to this are New Zealand wine, cherries, hides and skins, some forestry products, some aluminium, and many industrial goods exports. They'll become duty-free at entry into force. New Zealand beef exports to Korea, currently worth 120.6 million. They'll become duty and safeguard-free 15 years after entry into force. All duties on New Zealand kiwi fruit exports to Korea, currently 44.3 million, will be eliminated over 5 years. So, Mr Speaker, if we look at 5-yearly increments, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, what we'll see at the end of 5 years, 67.4% of current exports to Korea will become duty-free. At the end of 10 years, that goes up to 79.3%, and at the end of 15 years, that's 97.8%. Clearly a significant reduction in tariffs over time. Mr Speaker, we heard from a number of submitters, and I'd also like to comment to the Korea-New Zealand Business Council. They reminded us that Korea had already signed agreements with Chile, who are one of our major competitors in this space, the USA and EU, and more latterly with Canada and Australia. They commented that Korea had previously been a relatively closed market, and that over the past decade or so, the lever for that becoming more open was the big Korean electronic and car manufacturers becoming more internationalised. And we're seeing the benefit of that opening with this agreement. They also commented on New Zealand seafood, Mr Speaker, and even though mussels, the green-lipped mussel, will have a tariff rate quota placed on it, they commented that New Zealand seafood penetration and entry into the Korean market is a very good thing. More specifically, our green-lipped mussel is perceived as high quality and having hugely beneficial health effects. Now, as I'm sure many of us know, what they're relating to there is the perceived anti-inflammatory benefits of the green-lipped mussel, which may be beneficial to people with arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease and other inflammatory conditions. And they made the point that even though it has a TRQ, well respected and well looked at in the Korean market. Zespri also spoke to us. Zespri are big players, 1.4 billion in sales of kiwi fruit worldwide, and they're projecting to double the volume of their gold kiwi fruit in the next few years. For them, Korea is their 7th biggest market, and they differentiated the Korean market as being very discerning fruit consumers. Quality matters to them. And in their view, here's one of the competitive advantages we have over Chile, that our kiwi fruit is high quality, and the Korean consumer recognises that. Furthermore, in the kiwi fruit space, what's really interesting is that we're actually walking the walk with Korea. So here we are, we have this free trade agreement, but we actually have skin in the game already. Because what Zespri were telling us was that they're already capacity building and risk spreading the kiwi fruit market. They're doing that because they've actually got 100 hectares of kiwi fruit growers and of kiwi fruit that they're growing in Korea, and they employ 250 local growers. We truly do come to this agreement and bring to this agreement skin in the game. We're already employing people in Korea. We've already got our plants growing in Korea. For kiwi fruit growers, their current tariff is 45%. Chile has 0. There's the reason. There's our loss of competitive advantage right there, that this agreement will change. We also asked, Mr Speaker, about intellectual property concerns, because as we talk about growing our kiwi fruit in Korea, that might be a legitimate concern we would have with any country that we're doing trade with. We were reassured that there are absolutely no intellectual property, no IP concerns with our Korean partners. I'd also comment, while I'm on the kiwi fruit story, this is very good news for horticulturalists in Whangarei and the far north. We have a substantial horticulture industry that will benefit significantly from the tariff reduction on kiwi fruit. Mr Speaker, we also heard from Export New Zealand, and they talked to us about the importance of the free trade agreement in the context of Asia. And what they said, Mr Speaker, was this: the Korea market is an important one. It is a larger market than the UK and falls only a little behind Japan in market size. Given that New Zealand does not yet have FTA links with the US and Japan, this free trade agreement is New Zealand's third most important FTA after those with China and Australia. The duty savings achieved by this agreement are significant and will be greatly appreciated by our members. Export New Zealand also commented, just to highlight, they're focusing on the policy aspect and our relationship with Asia Pacific, which often we can get lost, or we can lose the importance of in the issue of tariffs. Sometimes that can be the highlight. It's very important, our relationship with Asia Pacific as well. Export New Zealand also commented, like many submitters did, on the ISDS provisions, the Investor State Dispute Settlements clauses, as my colleagues across the House have raised. And I wanted to read point 9 that they commented to us. We support the inclusion of the provisions on investment in this agreement. We believe that these will encourage New Zealand companies to invest in Korea and Korean companies to invest in New Zealand. Having an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism is an important protection for investors, and we support this. That's from Export New Zealand, Mr Speaker. They have 5,300 members, so they have some clout. They have a mandate to be speaking to us in this regard. I'd also like to comment on Fonterra, who were also submitters, clearly our biggest exporter. They said to us, the Korean Free Trade Agreement allows us to start having similar discussions with Korea as we have had and as we now have with China. So while part of their skim milk, as was commented, haven't been released under this tariff, they see this as opening wider opportunities with Korea. I'd like to read one of the points they commented on to us on the benefits. This is from Fonterra. Importantly, this agreement helps us to create a level playing field for the New Zealand dairy exporters relative to the EU, the US, Chile and Australia. The EU and US agreements in particular, which entered into force in 2011 and 2012, respectively, have put New Zealand at a significant competitive disadvantage. This disadvantage has started to be reflected in New Zealand's share of Korea's dairy imports, which has fallen from 14% in 2011 to 8% in 2014. Mr Speaker, on that point, I'd also like to comment on Fonterra's reflection on the free trade agreement and their benefit to introduce cheese into Korea. Historically, a key dairy export from New Zealand to Korea has been cheese. However, the preferential access for cheese negotiated by the EU and US has significantly eroded sales of cheese from New Zealand to Korea. The cheese outcome for New Zealand under the New Zealand-Korea FTA represents effective parity with the US and EU for cheddar and block mozzarella. This means that cheddar and block mozzarella exports from New Zealand will reach a zero tariff at the same time as the US and EU. Mr Speaker, I think this is an excellent agreement, and we heard from most submitters. Yes, we have some concerns which we've allayed around ISDS and some thinking to do on that, as our colleagues have spoken. But Mr Speaker, this agreement disproportionately advantages New Zealand. It's an agreement that's been worked on over many years, and I have complete faith in this agreement, and I commend it to the House. Thank you, Mr Speaker.